The World Might Do Me In, Chapter 4, A Bit of Control. It took them a few minutes to calm down from their laughter, Dani still holding the bunny. Tanya frowned. It looks so weird. It looks globby. She frowned in disgust, and Dani laughed again, her voice slipping back to normal. Dani shrugged, running a finger over the bunny's head. It actually doesn't feel that weird. Want to touch him? Sam frowned, standing from the desk chair, and carefully stepping over to Dani. Are you sure it's safe? He asked, frowning slightly. Dani nodded. Of course, I'd never let anything happen to you guys. The comment was casual, and she looked more content in that moment than she had since the accident, but still, for a brief moment, Sam saw her eyes flicker green. He shook his head. Maybe that one had been a trick of the light. He shook it off, slowly reaching out to the bunny blob. It seemed to sniff his hand for a moment before letting out a shrieking squeak and nestling into Dani's hand. It's okay. He's not going to hurt you. The bunny looked at her for a moment searchingly. Then it hopped down her arm, leaving a trail of ectoplasm as it sniffed Sam again, and this time allowed him to gently run a single finger over its head. Satisfied that Dani had been telling the truth, the bunny settled into the crook of her elbow and, by all appearances, went to sleep. Tanya giggled as Dani grinned. Sam, though, was thinking as he wiped the ectoplasm off his hand. How did it get here, though? That single question made Dani go as pale as her ghost form without ever changing. The portal's still open. With that, she sank through the floor. Tanya and Sam raced out of Dani's room and down to the lab. They found Dani standing in front of the portal, which was still open, swirling almost hypnotically. They stepped up to her, one on either side. She shook her head as if just noticing they were there. This thing has been open since yesterday. Who knows what all got out of here? Something tells me not every ghost is going to be as harmless like this little guy. Dani said, gently tapping the bunny on its nose. It squeaked, seeming to wake up and notice where they were. It nosed at the air for a moment, then hopped down out of Dani's arms and back through the portal. Her arm was left covered in ectoplasm. She frowned. What if something dangerous got out? My parents are ghost hunters who've never even seen a real ghost. Silence rang through the room as the gravity of the situation settled over them. I mean, you have superpowers now, Tanya commented. Tanya's comment was joking, but Dani turned to her, looking like she'd just handed her all of the answers she was looking for. Yes, I do. Sam caught on to what Dani was thinking and frowned slightly. You want to fight ghosts? Dani frowned. Not really, but I opened the portal. It's sort of my fault if they get out in the first place. So it would be my fault if they hurt someone. This time, when she looked back at the portal, there was conviction in her eyes. Tanya was grinning. You even have a secret identity, she said, bouncing slightly. Sam frowned. But Tanya was on a roll. When you first came out of that portal, I barely recognized you. As long as you don't get too close to somebody who knows you well, no one should recognize you as a ghost. Dani nodded slightly. That's not a bad idea, actually, Dani said, and Tanya bounced as Sam facepalmed. You just need a cool name, like Ghost Girl or the Female Phantom. Sam shook his head. You do remember that your parents hunt ghosts, right? What if they see you? He pointed out. What if they get hurt? Dani shot back. All their tools and training has never been tested. I don't even know if any of this stuff really works, she said, gesturing around the room, and Sam frowned, nodding. Fair, but there's no but. I need to figure out how to use these powers I've got to do some good. Sam nodded. That's noble, but we're going to need a place for you to train. Somehow, that led to Tanya's dad driving the three of them to a small campsite near Amity Park the next day after school. Sam's parents had apparently rented them a plot to camp out for the weekend. They'd be staying in a cabin nearby, but the three teens would be on their own for the most part. They'd gotten Jack and Maddie to agree easily enough. Maddie didn't want Dani anywhere near the ghost portal after the accident. Jazz agreed that Dani getting out of the house was a great idea. They'd be spending the weekend there, heading back on Sunday, which left them that night and all of Saturday for some practice. Sam finished setting up his tent and headed back outside to help the others. Dani's tent was all set up, but Tanya was having some troubles with hers, so Dani was helping hammer in a few of the tent spikes. Sam frowned.
"Should you be doing that with your hand messed up?"
he asked, and Tanya swore. "Shit, sorry, Dani. With everything that's been happening, I totally forgot about your burn." Dani shook her head. "Well, that's actually not a problem anymore." She unwrapped the bandage from around her hand, revealing a fully healed, shiny pink scar. It looked like someone had trapped a perfectly circular spray of lightning under the skin of Dani's palm. Sam took her hand and frowned. It looked old, way older than 2 days.
"How did you heal so fast?"
Dani shrugged. "No clue. I had to Google how long it takes burns to heal. Normally, 45 days. It barely took me 3. Tanya pulled off her beret, wiping away her sweat and pulling a face. "That shouldn't be physically possible." Dani nodded. "I know. I have a theory, though. Sam, can I borrow your knife?" He pulled his pocket knife out of his boot and handed it over.
"Yeah, why?"
She shook her head, tucking the knife into her pocket for a second as she pulled a duffel bag out of her tent. "I snuck into the lab last night and grabbed some equipment." She opened the duffel and pulled out a small cube. Tossing it into the grass, she watched as it popped open into a table. It was small, but big enough that they could work with it easily. She pulled 2 boxes of beakers out of the bag and set them on the table. She also pulled out a first aid kit, setting all of the items onto the table. Tanya and Sam frowned. What are you doing?" Tanya asked, and Dani pulled Sam's knife out of her pocket. "Testing a theory." And with no more warning than that, she ran the blade of the knife over the pad of her thumb. Tanya gasped, and Sam lunged forward to stop her, but she had already stopped and was staring at the blood welling from the cut. "Is it just me, or is my blood glowing?" Sam pushed his panic aside and lifted her cut thumb to his eye level. If she hadn't pointed it out, he might not have noticed. It wasn't overly bright, but yes, her blood was glowing. Tanya frowned at them. "And this tests your theory. How?" she asked, popping open the first aid kit. Dani shook her head. "Well, it tells me I need to not get cut around my parents. As oblivious as they can be, there's no way they won't notice glowing blood." Sam nodded, reaching for a Band-Aid from the kit. He wrapped it around her bleeding thumb. She frowned. "But I was gonna see what happens when I transform." Sam laughed lightly at Dani's pout.
"So you figured out how to do it when you want to?"
he asked. She wrinkled her nose at him. "Well, no." Sam nodded slightly.
"Maybe let's start there."
She nodded, and they began. They worked for hours trying to figure out just how her powers worked, and by the time the moon was up, none of them were any closer to figuring it out. But she had managed to successfully transform twice. They wound up roasting marshmallows and sausages around the fire, watching the stars, shooting ideas around the campfire for what her superhero name should be. "I like Phantom," Dani stated firmly.
"I still like Spectre,"
Sam offered, but Dani shook her head. "My parents have been drilling me on the different types of ghosts for years. A specter is defined as a threat. I don't want to be a threat," Dani stated, staring into the fire. Sam shrugged, popping a marshmallow in his mouth. "But why Phantom?" Tanya asked, and Dani frowned, leaning back against the log they were using as a bench. She stared up at the sky for a moment. "Mom always said there was only one kind of ghost that wasn't real. She called them phantoms. A phantom was an idea, one without real form like other ghosts. A phantom could be anything. A phantom could be good, which is why Mom always insisted they weren't real." She pulled her slightly charred marshmallow out of the fire with a frown. "So you're just gonna go with Phantom?" Tanya asked. Dani frowned. "I mean, I like my name. I think Dani Phantom works. What do you guys think?"
"It's a bit risky. I mean, Dani Fenton, Dani Phantom. There's not much of a difference,"
Sam pointed out, but Dani grinned as she skewered another marshmallow. "But think of it this way. No one is going to associate the name of a ghost hunter with a ghost, Dani said, holding her marshmallow over the fire. Tanya nodded. That's one way of thinking of it. Chapter 5, Changing. When they got back on Sunday, Dani approached her mom. Maddie was making dinner in the kitchen. She smiled at her daughter as she approached her. Hey, Mom. Hey, sweetie. How are you feeling? Better after a bit of fun with your friends? Dani nodded. Yeah, but I wanted to ask you something. Anything, sweetie? Maddie said, stepping a bit closer to her daughter. Dani frowned. You're a black belt, right? Maddie nodded, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. I am. Would you mind maybe showing me some moves? Maybe not lessons. I know you and Dad are too busy for that. Maddie stepped over to Dani and pulled her into a hug. Dani, sweetie, I'm never too busy for you. How about after school on Tuesdays? Dani nodded, grinning as she pulled away. Thanks, Mom. That's perfect. Dani hugged her mom again, but seemed to pull her hands away quickly. Maddie frowned as Dani hid her hands behind her back with a slightly forced grin. But one of her hands was still wrapped because of the burn. Maddie knew how self-conscious her daughter was, and the permanent scar the injury would leave would be a blow to her already perilously fragile teen ego. So she let the odd behavior slide without comment. A month blurred by after the accident. Dani, Sam, and Tanya desperately hid her powers from everyone. They quickly learned that strong enough emotions would trigger her powers, but it was unpredictable which power would manifest with which emotion. They also learned quickly to cover for her odd behavior and sudden disappearances when she accidentally fell through floors or went invisible and couldn't figure out how to get back to normal. In that month, Dani's father installed a door on the portal, but that didn't stop a few smaller ghosts from slipping through. Globby the bunny slipped through a few times just to follow Dani around. It was sweet, but the few times her parents had seen it, she'd had to intervene quickly so they didn't catch it and start experimenting on it. But she now had a pillow reserved for the bunny under her bed where her parents wouldn't see it. But unfortunately for Dani, the harmless bunny was not the only ghost that slipped through the portal. Several ghosts that Dani could only describe as octopi had slipped through and tried to strangle Sam and Tanya. She'd managed to save them, but her nerves were fraying fast. She frowned as she stepped through the halls of Casper High with Sam and Tanya. I'm thinking about telling them. Sam frowned.
Really? Aren't they still making a bunch of ghost hunting weapons?
Dani sighed. I mean, yeah, but what else am I supposed to do? If anyone finds out about my powers, I immediately go from invisible nerd to straight up freak, she said as she walked through a snack machine next to the staff room. Sam frowned as Dani shivered back into view. It was odd seeing her vanish from view and sort of melt back into it. They were lucky the hallway was empty. Tanya shook her head. And if your ghost hunter parents don't take it well? Dani sighed and rubbed her head as they headed towards the cafeteria. Of course, none of them expected Sam's latest philanthropic endeavor, changing the school menu to something healthier, ultra-recyclo-vegetarian, to backfire so spectacularly, and summon the ghost of a lunch lady who was beyond incensed that the menu had been altered for the first time in 50 years. Dani had never wished harder that she had some control over her powers than when her transformation fizzled out and she was shoved aside. The now meat-covered ghost snatched up Sam and took off. Dani didn't even have a chance to change back into Phantom. Instead, Lancer caught her and Tanya by the arm and dragged them off to his office. Paulina giggling behind them, despite the dirt and grass in her hair. Lancer frowned as he pulled 2 files out of his desk. Miss Tanya Foley, higher than average grade point in everything but gym. Danielle Fenton, 34 dropped beakers in the last month alone, banned for life from handling anything fragile on school property. But mostly clean records from both of you before today. So would one of you kindly explain to me why you both conspired to start the largest food fight in Casper High history? He was shouting by the end of the sentence, and Dani flinched. She hadn't quite realized how out of control her distraction was going to be. The fact that she'd also thrown the first turf witch at Paulina, who had been loudly complaining that Sam was interfering with her regular perfect diet, was not going to get them anywhere. Lancer ranted at them for a few minutes before standing. I will deal with your punishment when I get back, ladies. The minute Lancer was out of the room, Dani hopped to her feet and stepped over to Lancer's monitor. Think you can get into the school security system? We need to find Sam, she asked, and Tanya nodded, pulling her PDA out and hooking it up to the computer and quickly accessing what they needed. Dani transformed and grabbed Tanya's arm, and they phased through the floor, uncaring that when Lancer found them gone, they were going to be in a world of trouble. Dani didn't have much luck fighting the lunch lady, but she managed to get both Sam and Tanya out of there and away from the school. She hadn't ever spent this much time using her powers, so she hadn't expected to pass out midair. Luckily for them, they were more hovering than flying at that point. They landed hard, and Dani flickered back to herself, out cold on the asphalt. It didn't take Sam and Tanya long to figure out that there was no force on heaven or earth that was going to wake the sleeping teen right now. So Tanya helped Sam pick her up in a piggyback, and they carried her back to her house. They had to breathe a sigh of relief at the oblivious idiots that were Dani's parents as Sam carefully deposited her on her bed. She was still out cold. He sighed as Tanya pulled out her PDA.
Looking up another way to get me kidnapped by ghosts,
Sam bit out. Tanya had been the one who had blurted out who had changed the menu. But she just rolled her eyes at him.
I want to see if I can figure out who she was. I mean, ghosts are dead people, right?
Sam shrugged.
I have no idea.
There seemed to be an unspoken truce here while Dani lay unconscious on the bed between them. The menu didn't matter when their friend might be dying all over again. About an hour later, Tanya let out a noise of triumph.
I think I found her.
Sam stepped over to her and looked at the PDA over her shoulder. She'd pulled up an obituary. It was about 10 years old. Tanya began to read off the information there. The family of Patricia Keaton is sad to announce that she has passed away. She experienced heart failure on the way to work at Casper High, where she has been a cafeteria worker for almost 40 years. She scrolled to the photo. The outfit was the same, the pink dress and white apron and pink hairnet. This woman, though, lacked the ghost's green skin and red eyes. Tanya shook her head as she went back to reading. Though she leaves behind no children, she is survived by her sister Paula and her love and care for the children of Casper High. So it looks like she was the one who built the menu you changed. It was the only legacy she left behind. Sam frowned. That did set a twinge of guilt through him, but the menu had been a bit outdated. He sighed.
Let's just not talk about it until Dani wakes up, okay?
They lapsed back into silence, and Sam returned to the desk chair, watching the bed like a hawk. Dani didn't stir for another few hours. The sun was beginning to set by that point, and Sam was starting to panic when she finally jolted awake. Tanya turned it into a joke, tricking Dani into thinking she'd been out for 4 days.
That's not funny, Tanya.
Their argument devolved into both of them slamming their way out of the room. Dani sighed, rubbing her head and standing, wobbling slightly. Before she could make it all the way down to the kitchen, her dad spotted her on the stairs.
Dani, your friends said you were overworking yourself a bit today, so I thought I'd make you some dinner. Your mom's working down in the lab and Jazz is out at the library.
He held up a large plate of pancakes and bacon.
Breakfast for dinner, your favorite.
She grinned at him and made it down the stairs and into the kitchen. It was nice to sit and eat with her father, even while he babbled about his latest invention, the Fenton weasel, a sort of ghostly vacuum. It was supposed to siphon off ghost energy, or maybe trap them entirely. Even Jack wasn't entirely sure. But the thought of what his reaction might be when he found out about her powers put her off her dinner a bit. The thought of him using his inventions on her made her slightly nauseous. She excused herself quickly and went up to her room to do what little homework she could, with her mind buzzing with nightmare images of Sam ripped apart by a ghost while she was getting detention from Lancer, and her parents relishing experimenting on her as Dani Phantom. She shook her head. Thoughts like that were going to rob her of what little sleep she was going to get tonight. Her parents had never even seen Dani Phantom. There was no reason to think they would shoot first. They still hadn't really seen any ghost. She'd managed to convince them that Globby the bunny was a trick of the light. As if summoned, the tiny ghost phased through her sheets, and she grinned lightly. Hey, buddy. It chirped at her, and she set down her pencil and curled up on the bed, the bunny safely tucked out of sight in her arms. So what if she'd have to wake up early to wash off the ectoplasm? At least she was sure the bunny wasn't going to be a threat.